Hi, everybody. We'll just give it a couple of minutes to let everybody join, but thanks for joining this morning, and we'll get going in a couple of minutes, as I say. Hi, everybody who's just joined. Welcome. We will start in it. We'll give it another minute or so. There are still people joining, so we'll get going in a minute or so. Thanks. Great. I think we'll get started. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining today. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from today. My name is Rob Stevens. I'm Director of Policy at Climate Care Natural Capital Partners, and myself and Rachel, my colleague, who's Director of Project Development, will be hosting the webinar today. Just before we dive in, to give you a little idea of the admin. So firstly, we'll aim to talk for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. So please, if you have any questions along the way, please could you add them to the Q&A field, and then we'll get to those at the end. In terms of structure, Rachel's going to give a quick introduction overview of Climate Care Natural Capital Partners, and then I'll dive into an overview of COP26 and what we saw happening up there, and then go into a bit more specific detail around carbon markets and what the outcomes were for the carbon markets, and then specifically what that may mean for the voluntary carbon market going forwards. And then, as I say, we'll finish off with questions and answers. So please, as we go along, just pile in with your questions on the Q&A field. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rachel. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the session.
Great. Morning, afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. So for those of you who do not know Climate Care and Natural Capital Partners very well, and I know that many people on the call do, but for those of you who don't, I thought it'd be worth just giving you a little bit of context so that you understand where we get our insights from, and so that you have some confidence that you're spending your next few minutes wisely. So Natural Capital Partners and Climate Care merged earlier this year. The mission of the company is to deliver impacts at scale, and we're very proud to have delivered over 100 million tonnes of CO2 reduction in our lifetime, and improved over 46 million lives. And you can see a number of other lovely statistics there around forest, clean energy, safe water, etc. Obviously, all of the projects that we work with and develop have very significant co-benefits. In order to achieve that, yeah, we've worked with an awful lot of projects, many projects around the world, and we've worked with projects across all sorts of technologies, methodologies. We've written new methodologies, numerous countries, and we work with projects in very different ways. So we're sort of very flexible in how we do that, right through to doing a lot more investing right from the earliest stages of project development with those project partners. Both companies have been in the industry for many years and helped to shape a lot of the voluntary carbon market, and we continue to play a role in the sort of the major bodies and associations where those conversations are happening around how the sector continues to evolve. And we have a huge client base around the globe, including many of the sort of biggest blue chip companies with the most ambitious carbon programs. And many of those clients we've worked with for a long time. So, you know, very much a sort of trusted partner for those clients, and you know, tackling increasingly complex requirements for those clients as well. And we do that by being, we are around the world as well. So we've got folks from Climate Care and Natural Capital Partners right the way across the globe. How we work with clients and projects, very briefly. So for clients, and that can be, I've talked a lot about corporate clients, but we work also for governments on government-to-government trades and so on, and increasingly with investors who want exposure to the market. And it's really about long-term partnering, and as I say, increasingly complex solutions for people who are aiming sort of long-term for net zero, and in the meantime, how do they remain carbon neutral through that period? So looking at all sorts of ways of doing that, from purchasing credits right the way through to taking risk on investments in new projects. And then on the project side, again, you know, trusted partner, we could bring technical expertise. So we've taken numerous projects through different standards. So we kind of know how that process works. Financing from very early development stages, so you know, right from feasibility stage, significant access to corporate market and investors, and then kind of our sector scars from having been in this industry for a long time now, for many years. So seeing the ups and downs of it, and seeing amazing projects and projects that had problems. So you know, that's something that we really want to bring to bear, is that we've seen what good looks like, we've seen some of the pitfalls, and that's something that we want to bring to the projects that we work with, because we all have an incentive for those to succeed. So that's just to give a very quick bit of context as to who we are and where we get our insights from. And with that, I'll hand back to Rob, who had a fairly hectic week in Glasgow last month.
Thanks, Rachel. So before we dive into to what happened at COP and what we think are the implications of what happened, just wanted to ask you all a question, because this is something we've been thinking about ourselves. So in a minute, a poll will come up. So if you could just click one of the answers. But really, we just wanted to know, from your point of view, has COP26 and what you know about it to date made the landscape more or less complicated for project developers? I think we've got our own views, but it'd be interesting to see what you guys think. So if you could go ahead and answer that. Don't know how long it takes for the answers to come back. Okay, could you move the slides on, and we'll get going, and hopefully the answers will jump up in front of us in a minute. Oh, there we go. Oh, well, not quite what I was expecting anyway, but you know, it's certainly most people at least would consider that it's made it more complicated, but it's interesting to see how much more uncertainty, if you like, it seems to have brought to the community. So so hopefully today we'll be able to lift a little bit of that fog, but also just to sort of put into context, you know, there is going to be fog over the next few years, but it doesn't mean that we're not seeing increased action and ambition. So COP26, what happened and what does it all mean? If you can move on, please, Kate. So firstly, most of you, I'm sure, have been to COPs and have been involved in the process over the years, but just to, I think it's worth putting in context. So firstly, COP26, it was 30 years in the making. It's part of a process that started back in the 90s. And as you know, there's a COP every year except for last year. But this one particularly had a lot of focus on it, and a lot of pressure really to make decisions and to come to agreement. There have been kind of milestone COPs over the years. Copenhagen in 2009, which didn't result in the outcome that everyone was hoping for. But this one really was there to increase ambition in the face of much clearer science, increase ambition, increase urgency, and really get to the point of implementing the Paris Agreement and really getting started properly in this decade on large-scale decarbonisation. And surprisingly, from our point of view, considering COVID, considering the difficulties in travelling that we've all experienced over the last couple of years, the attendance in Glasgow was a record. There were nearly 40,000 delegates, 39,500, which you can see is bigger than any of the previous recent COPs. And interestingly, governments there were a few more attendees, but actually what we anecdotally saw was that maybe some of the global south countries found it more difficult to get to than usual. And you can see as well, there are a lot of observers, a lot of advocates, lobbyists, interested parties outside of government that were there to put their case across. You can move on, Kate, please. So we tried to, we did a webinar before COP saying what can we expect and what can we hope for, and we split it into three categories: ambition, quality, and integrity. And the outcome really was pretty good in terms of most of the big ticket things that we were expecting, but there were some elements that were that weren't agreed or weren't up to expectations. So firstly, on the ambition side, almost 90% of NDCs now target net zero, which would have been unheard of 5 years ago. And tracking was improved in terms of reaching the 2 degrees Paris Agreement threshold, but obviously there was a real pressure, scientific pressure, to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and we are not there yet in terms of the ambitions of the combined NDCs under the Paris Agreement. There's a big commitment in terms of aligning finance with this decarbonisation transition, but it's quite difficult to understand how much of that is kind of recommitted old money. But there were some really unusual or surprising progressions that happened, particularly the US and China declaration paving the way for earlier NDC updates. On the integrity side, I think this is where we saw the biggest gap in commitments, and that really was on the failure to deliver the $100 billion a year commitment to least developed countries, and also this unresolved issue of adaptation, loss and damage finance. So that is something that we will see the focus of next year's COP. On the quality side, there were some good improvements, and this is where we get into the technicalities of monitoring, verification, and and reporting and transparency. We'll come on to Article 6 in a moment, but that was finalized to enable international carbon markets. There were significant improvements made in reporting and transparency, and also capacity building agreed for developing economies. So, overall, in summary, there was big progress made, but there's still a lot more to do. My colleague Jonathan Shopley, who a number of you will know, is a big fan of fungi, and he uses this analogy a lot, and I think it's a really useful one. So the mushroom that is the flowering part of a huge fungal network underground, and in this case, the mushroom of COP26, when everything came to the fore, that's dead now. But the mycelium, the fungi, the huge network of activity that's going on behind the scenes and underground out of sight has really strengthened, and its reach has expanded as a result of COP. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there were lots and lots of coalitions made, pledges made, progress made on financing, which are in some cases government backed and driven, but in many cases they're driven by the private sector and by civil society. So we see an awful lot going on behind the scenes and behind the headlines of COP26, which is really encouraging for us. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I'll come on in a bit more detail into the specifics of what happened around carbon markets, and particularly, well, I'll then speak a little bit more about the voluntary market and how we see that developing. So you guys know, one of the outstanding pieces of the Paris Agreement that hasn't been agreed or wasn't agreed was Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 6 is the section, the element of the Paris Agreement, which provides the framework and the rules for the continuation of carbon markets as part of the solution to climate change and to reaching the Paris objectives. As I said, since 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, Article 6 has proved really difficult in terms of negotiation, and it had been going on for 6 years. And to an extent, COP26 in Glasgow was seen as almost a last chance saloon in terms of getting Article 6 agreement. What we're really glad to say, and you guys will already know, is that thankfully Article 6 was agreed in COP26. And so it gives us, it's really encouraging. It cements the place of carbon markets in the response to climate change that we're going to see over the next 30 years on an international basis. And yeah, with that, thank you, UNFCCC team. These are the guys who have been working tirelessly for the last 6 years. This is the moment that Alok Sharma brought the gavel down on Article 6, and you can see, I think that's probably relief as much as celebration. Specifically on Article 6, there are a number of parts of it, but the ones we'll concentrate on today and the ones that are most relevant to the work we do, Article 6.2, which is setting out the rules for the transfer of emission reduction units between parties, so between nation states, in pursuit of their NDC targets. So this is really the framework for setting out the import and export of emission reductions between countries to reach their NDCs. Article 6.4 is there to set out the successor to the Clean Development Mechanism. So set up a UN managed mechanism and standard to enable finance for mitigation activities through the trade and retirement of carbon credits. So that really is a successor to the CDM. You can, thanks, Kate. So before I dive into the weeds of this, it's really important to note that Article 6 and the Paris Agreement does not explicitly set any rules for the voluntary carbon market. It is really there to set the rules for compliance markets and for trading between nations. Although its kind of tentacles do spread a little bit further than just nation-to-nation trading. So on Article 6.2, what we got agreement, and the key points are, we got a further definition of what the new unit is, the unit for importing and exporting emission reductions, which we know before was called an ITMO, Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcome. But we now know that it represents 1 ton of CO2e. Before we went into COP, there were questions as to whether there would be other metrics such as electricity generation units that could be ITMOs, and it includes both reductions and removals in terms of emission reductions. Another outstanding issue was that of corresponding adjustments. How would it work in terms of making sure that the host country and the receiving country didn't double count one single emission reduction against its against 2 NDC commitments? And what was agreed is that corresponding adjustments would need to take place for all emission reductions that are being transferred from one country to another, whether or not it's inside or outside of the host country's NDC. So that's an important point, so that you can't generate an ITMO unless it has a corresponding adjustment, whatever the activity is in the host that's generating the ITMO. So host countries have the authority to decide whether emission reductions are used to deliver against national targets, so from one party to another, are used for other international mitigation purposes, and that is a quote from the Article 6 text, and that is to include CORSIA as a compliance regime, and potentially other compliance regimes in the future. Well, there's a third potential use, which is undefined. It's called for other purposes, but the definition of other purposes is left undefined. And some have considered that this means this covers the voluntary carbon market. Others have said it excludes the voluntary carbon market, but is actually there for future compliance regimes, such as in the shipping sector, for example. Another key point is that VERs, as we know and love them now, gold standard VERs, VCUs, for example, can be turned into ITMOs with the correct corresponding adjustment authorization. So it's important to note you don't have to register your project through the Article 6.4 standard in order to potentially get corresponding adjustments. Article 6.4, the successor to the Clean Development Mechanism. This was another thing that had been very toughly negotiated over the last 5 or 6 years. There were some key sticking points, but again, we got agreement. And just by way of summary, a new supervisory board will be set up in 2022 with 12 members initially, and they will drive the setup of the new mechanism, as yet unnamed, but it seems it will be called the Sustainable Development Mechanism. There will be new baselines below business as usual in order to try to drive more rapid decarbonisation. Crediting periods will change for projects that are registered under this new mechanism. So there will be options, a crediting period of 5 years, which will be renewable twice, so up to 15 years in total. A 10-year non-renewable crediting period, or specifically for removals projects, a longer potential crediting period. Firstly, of 15 years, which would then potentially be renewable twice. So up to a 45-year crediting period on removals projects. CDM activities, so projects that are already registered to CDM can continue to use the current methodology until the end of 2025, provided they request transition to the new mechanism before the end of 2023. So there will be a grandfathering and transition period, which is between now and 2025. But for those project developers who are already registered CDM, then you have to request the transition in the next couple of years. One big bone of contention in terms of the negotiations is whether any CER units from pre-Paris, so 2020 vintage and earlier, would be permissible to be used by countries to reach their NDC targets in the first commitment period of NDC. And it was agreed that CER units that are vintage 2013-2020, as long as the project was registered from the 1st of January 2013 onwards, can be used by countries in this first NDC period. And you won't need to, or the country won't need to seek a corresponding adjustment for that, because it was pre-Paris Agreement. There are different estimations as to how many tons this might bring into the market, but it's the UNFCCC's best guess is somewhere around 100 to 120 million tons, something like that. If you can move on, please, Kate. So as I said, the voluntary market is not specifically, or the rules of the voluntary market are not specifically given or written down in Article 6. But what it has done, it's provided more guide rails, and it has sped up the debate as to what future best practice will be in the voluntary carbon market. So what we're firstly seeing is that what was climate leadership in terms of corporate voluntary action is now becoming climate responsible. It's becoming, the baseline, if you like. So ambition and scale and speed of action is now growing in a way that we haven't seen before, and we expect will continue. Countries, because they have the authority to provide corresponding adjustments or not, they will decide whether and how to encourage private sector investment within their national mitigation activities. So where in the past the voluntary market has operated slightly outside of the sort of government network, it will become more important to be in close contact with your host country governments in the future. Standards obviously will need to keep abreast of new policies and regulation to maintain integrity, particularly of additionality. And this is because additionality in business as usual is going to be a moving feast to an extent, because countries will keep increasing their ambition over time. Stakeholder initiatives, specifically the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, will become important arbiters of high integrity claims. So we've seen a lot of opinion, a lot of positions within stakeholders in the voluntary market as to how best the voluntary market should operate in the future. And these, as I say, will be important. But particularly, we do think the VCMI, which is due to provide recommendations in the spring of next year, will become important in terms of determining best practice in voluntary action. And claims will reflect whether voluntary action supports mitigation to achieve or exceed a country's NDC, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a sec. What we do know for sure is that the new modalities, the new rules for the VCM will be worked out over the coming 2 or 3 years, and then the transition period to implement those rules will take even longer. But everyone recognizes that there will be a transition. So yeah, we will work through that together. Next slide, please, Kate. So what COP has done is strengthened our view, and not just our view, but many in the voluntary carbon market, that the VCM will move towards multiple tracks, and that will open up new opportunities for buying and selling voluntary market and of course compliance market certified credits. This schematic is from the gold standard actually, but it also fits in with the view of ICROA and other stakeholders. So on the left hand side, carbon credits will be aligned with the Paris Agreement and also the core voluntary carbon market principles, and they'll be determined by some of these stakeholders, potentially, for example, the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon market. And then some of those credits, which are third-party verified to one of the standards, some will be authorized for use as ITMOs under Article 6, and some won't. And that will be determined by the host country, as I said. But there will be multiple uses and different uses for both authorized and non-authorized credits. On the authorized ones, they can be used, as I've already mentioned, between parties to transfer for use of achieving NDCs. They can be used for voluntary offsetting, and they can be used for compliance schemes such as the CORSIA offset scheme. But non-authorized credits can also, there are multiple uses for those, particularly domestic use within country, and also, again, for voluntary action. And we're seeing more and more of our corporate clients interested in helping the countries that they do business in to achieve their NDCs, so financing emission reductions within host countries. If you can move on, please, Kate. What we see, and what we've seen over the last couple of years, and what we believe will be the short to mid-term future at least, is that the demand in the voluntary carbon market has grown, as you guys know, a lot in the last couple of years, and it's been driven mainly by corporate commitments and corporate action, which has accelerated at a pace that we in the market haven't seen before. This graph is taken from a recent report that we published, where we looked at the Fortune 500 countries, and we do this every year, and commitments around carbon neutrality, science-based targets, and net zero amongst those companies has increased by a quarter over the last year. But it's interesting to see that takes it up to 38% of the Fortune 500 countries that have one of these commitments. So there are still nearly 2/3 of them that haven't made a commitment yet. And so we see there is still a lot of room for expansion in terms of commitments. So we consider that the voluntary carbon market demand will likely continue its growth, albeit with an element of certain uncertainty, if you like, in the transition to the Paris implementation. So all of the things that I've mentioned, where there are unknowns, they will continue to be unknown, and things will wind out over the next 2 or 3 years. But we don't expect it to slow corporate demand down. Next slide, please. So just in summary, before I hand back over to Rachel, yeah, I've already mentioned a few times, there will be a period of uncertainty as best practice in the voluntary carbon market is determined. And even once we have those rules, the transition will take 5 years or more. And that's really because it's going to take that long for the Sustainable Development Mechanism, or whatever it's called, to be up and running, but also, more importantly, getting the infrastructure and the governance sorted out around corresponding adjustments and accounting across borders. And there will be countries, that adopt that mechanism quickly, and there will be others that will be slower. Host countries will play more of a part in voluntary action than they have before, as I mentioned. The corporates will continue to support projects that resonate with their business and support their immediate, midterm, and long-term commitments. And I think it's worth saying here that we have seen a step change in both the length of commitment and the scale of commitment with our corporate partners over the last couple of years. I mean, a lot of them now, mainly driven by net zero commitments, are looking, at 15 to 20 year time horizons, albeit with milestone targets along the way on a kind of 3 and 5 and 10 year horizon. So we're confident that corporates will still want to be funding projects and will continue to do so at larger scale and over longer periods. But how they speak about those actions will change, and it will depend on what is considered best practice in terms of communicating those actions. And as I said, there are lots of stakeholders at the moment trying to work that out, and we will get clarity over the next 6 months to a year. All of this means that managing risks and delivery will become more complex to an extent, and even more important. And so, yeah, but it's not impossible to do. In fact, it's very possible. It's just that new considerations will have to be taken into account around relationship with host countries, understanding that the objectives of the end buyers and the corporate buyers, and also just keeping close to the standards and managing that process. And with that, I'll hand back over to Rachel.
Good. So just a quick wrap up really on what does all this mean for project developers and the world that I and you guys exist in. So I think firstly, it's clear there's money out there and there's expertise in certain places as well for projects, and including from the earliest development stages as people really try to take a longer term view on how they achieve their objectives and how they secure supply. I think one of the reflections I have is it's about finding the right money. There is plenty of money out there, but finding the right money that fits with the project, the way that you work, the expertise and support that you need. It's never that easy getting money from people, even when it apparently looks like it. So, being able to sort of navigate that is pretty critical if it's not going to soak up your entire time. And I think, as you know from all of the foregoing, there's a lot of uncertainty still out there for everybody, projects, investors, corporates. So, the increased scrutiny on reputation, on delivery risk isn't going to go away anytime soon. And we spend a lot of our time working with clients, investors on helping them think through that. I think it presents a fantastic opportunity for scaling, and importantly for scaling more quickly and doing things more quickly at the moment when you're at this quite special point in this market, where people do want to take action and are prepared to invest and make increasingly large commitments. Being able to move quickly has real value. And so, where you can find the partnerships that allow you to do that, then that's gold, frankly. And I think the other observation is working with various project partners who are scaling rapidly. That's quite challenging. It's one thing to scale up a project, but actually going to new regions, new countries, and so on, that's quite a step change for the company, not just the project. So sort of having support for that environment, I think is pretty critical from where I stand. And the final one is, I think that this opportunity to innovate, and we're seeing more appetite from some of our corporate clients in terms of wanting to put a portion of their investment into new technologies, new methodologies, and we've worked on new methodologies in cooking and building materials and so on. And critically, it's looking for where things can scale, not for sort of very niche areas, but I think that's kind of an exciting opportunity that all of this presents. So I will stop there, and we will open the floor to questions. And you should be able
Rachel.
to questions in the Q&A box, I think.
Yeah, we haven't got any so far, which is unusual. Please, does anyone have any questions? Please put them in the Q&A box. Whilst we wait for that, Rachel, I think I had a question for you, which is, what kind of projects are we looking for and looking to fund, and what are our corporates interested in, our corporate end buyers?
Yes, in terms of the constants, if you like, that we look for is fantastic partners who are on the ground and the right stakeholder engagement on the ground. And that doesn't necessarily mean people who have done carbon a lot of times before. That's something that we can bring. We understand what it takes to make something into a carbon project. Potential to scale. So corporate requirements have gone from tens of thousands a year to millions of tons a year. So scale is super important. We look for great project partners to work with across all methodologies and technologies. I would say at the moment, the current flavour of the month is, because of this focus on net zero, there's a lot of emphasis, particularly for new investments, around carbon removals. So reforestation, afforestation, restoration type projects. Then spend a lot of time educating clients on what the risk profile looks like on that and the time to actually realise carbon credits. But equally, you know, for investors, interestingly, energy projects, so anything in, you know, stoves, water, etc., you know, they bring, you know, the opportunity for earlier cash flows. So, you know, they look for potentially a slightly different mix. Yeah, so yeah, all sorts at the moment. But as I say, very strong focus on nature-based solutions at the moment.
Great, thanks, Rachel. We've got a couple of questions in. I'll give this one to you from Krishnan, actually, and then I'll answer Joe's question. So Krishnan asks why nature-based solution projects are getting a lot of attention recently. I think you touched on it, but maybe give a bit more detail about why they are the focus.
Yeah, so net zero has had a lot to do with that. The alternatives to doing, you know, nature-based removals, of course, are mechanical, which come in, you know, they're just very, very expensive still. So whether that's carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, etc. And, you know, look, I hope all of these can scale. I hope all of these become affordable and scalable, because frankly, we need every single thing that we can possibly do. But at the moment, you know, nature-based removals are the most available and most cost-effective, and of course they meet a lot of the other things that corporates want to talk about around co-benefits and biodiversity, etc., etc. So there are lots of other characteristics, and the same goes for, you know, for MBS avoidance. And we talk a lot to our clients about, you know, in the rush to net zero, you do need to have a transition period where you remain carbon neutral through that period, and that's about avoidance. And there is simply no point cutting down primary forest and then furiously planting to compensate for that. So, you know, there are a lot of potential stories for them around social and environmental co-benefits. And, you know, we really see people picking in a portfolio. They might have a mix, you know, they always have a budget, and they have a profile, and then they have geographic considerations. You know, they want to be aligned with their operations, for example. And then they usually want a, you know, a small number of projects that they're really going to talk about a lot and they want to participate in, and it might be an overlap with their operations or their supply chain and so on. And that's where the, you know, the real scrutiny comes, and they're making, you know, big investments over 10, 20-year period in those projects. So, you know, they really want those benefits to be aligned with their corporate objectives. Thanks, Rachel. And just to add to that, Krishnan, I think what we did see with the kind of invention of the Science-Based Targets Initiative and you know, a net zero and getting to the state in 10 or 20 years or even 30 years, where we're talking about removing what's left after a huge decarbonisation effort. There was a huge shift towards removals, which at the expense of other types of projects. But what we're seeing now is a correction, if you like, back still with removals as an important long-term goal, but a recognition that the avoidance projects that, you know, make up most of the project types are still really important to be supporting at this time as we decarbonize over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So so it's not all about removals, is what I'm trying to say. You know, there is there's a lot of focus getting back onto avoidance, which is helping the decarbonisation transition. And methane as well. And methane, yeah, short-lived, but potent gases for sure. The next question is from Joe. Regarding factors that will affect marketing of credits projects, you did not mention the emergence of carbon rating agencies such as Calix, Silvera, B0. These actors are challenging our reliance on the standards to lend credibility to our project outcomes and may affect the investment customer landscape. Any thoughts? That's a really good question. We're seeing new players coming into the market over the last couple of years. Joe, the first thing I would say is that we, as an organization, have never 100% relied on the standards in order to deem the quality of a project. We have our own
due diligence process as well, which goes into the same sort of detail as some of the ratings agencies. So, you know, we've done that process without really talking about it, you know, for a long time. I think the rating agencies will be a useful reference for buyers. But yeah, I mean, what do you think, Rachel? Because we've always done that assessment ourselves, it doesn't feel like a new layer. But you know, in terms of transparency, I think we welcome, you know, that the scrutiny is being put onto projects to make sure that they are of a high enough quality and integrity, because that really is, you know, that is the key thing for us, is the environmental integrity of the projects we're working with.
Yeah, I think anything that challenges and forces the standards to improve, and additionally, you know, better ways of monitoring and reporting and so on, and the new technologies in development there, you know, those are all things will inevitably drive the standards to a higher point and greater consistency. But I think it's fundamentally, this is one of the difficult things about this market. It's not like you can stick a meter on a solar power plant and see how much clean energy you've generated. It's just not quite a cookie cutter world, as anyone involved in it knows. It's the ton of carbon is a common thing, but everything else is, you know, it's not like putting a meter on a power plant. So I think that's one of the things that investors and clients and corporates do really struggle with, is how do they make sure that the integrity of what they're buying, or what they're, even more significantly, what they might be investing in and talking a lot about over 10 to 20 years, is paramount. And so, you know, that's where we do spend a lot of time talking to them to help them understand kind of what's actually happening on those projects, and you know, what the risks are and how they're being managed. So yeah, I think and the sophistication of some of the corporates is growing, you know, quite rapidly, as they really, you know, some of them are a lot more hands-on than others, and you know, are also challenging what they see coming back, even though it's been through the standards.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's there's a lot of information out there that people aren't always able to make full sense of.
Next question is from Sandy. What is your outlook for pre-2013 CERs? Sandy, but I think it depends, I think, what you mean by pre-2013. So in terms of vintage pre-2013, you know, they would be outside of the kind of looking back age vintage that we would be providing for our corporate clients. If you're talking about projects that are registered pre-2013, which as a result are not eligible under Article 6.4 for NDC use, you know, that it's, in that case, it's the vintage that's more important for, you know, within the voluntary carbon market. So if they are newer vintages, but a project that was registered previous to 2013, then you know, they still have value in terms of corporate offset portfolios. Chris has asked a tricky question. For MBS projects, could you give your opinion on any likely changes to additionality and permanence requirements, given the increasing overlap of BCM with compliance markets? I mean, I'll just comment really quickly on that. Rachel, if you have anything to add, I think it's really difficult to see where this might end up. What I do know is that all of the standards are, you know, scratching their heads furiously, trying to work out how these may change. It's a really unsatisfactory answer, I'm afraid, Chris. I don't think we've got the crystal ball answer to this one. But Rachel, have you got anything to add?
No, I mean, I'd say exactly the same. It's not going to get easier. The standards will only get tougher.
Sandeep, another question: when can we expect new regulation for Article 6.4 projects? That's a good question, Sandeep. I think I mentioned that the supervisory board was going to start meeting in early 2022. I don't think that so far they've given a deadline as to when the 6.4 mechanism will be fully operational. I mean, clearly it has to be before 2025 because that's when the grandfathering period finishes for CDM projects. So our kind of working assumption will be towards the end of 2023, early 2024, we'll have much more clarity, and you know, they might start accepting new projects onto the 6.4 mechanism around that time. So yeah, a couple of years, we think.
An interesting question from Franz, talking about sort of charismatic carbon credits and particularly in LDCs and you know, strong developmental impacts and so on projects, and whether or not those achieve premium prices, and if so, how those premium prices can be realised. I would say it's all about finding the right buyer. If you can find, you know, some corporates and some investors they're quite open, and investors are, you know, they're very return driven. Of course, it has to be high integrity, and you know, that they're worrying about all of the, you know, the reputational and delivery risks more broadly. The corporates are the ones that will want something that resonates particularly with them. And if it's, you know, healthcare companies, something, you know, around clean water or improved health benefits, you know, as an obvious example, or whether it fits with, you know, geographically where they operate, or something related to their business. And you know, it's really about finding that match. Where's the project that you know, is special to that client? And so, you know, we spend a lot of time trying to understand what clients want, and sometimes they'll start off with this very, sometimes frankly with a completely impossible, you know, I'd like, it's a bit like when you're buying a house, you know, I'd like that huge house on that particular street, and it's like, well, you can't afford it, but what, you know, or it's not quite near enough to your office, whatever trade-offs you have to make. So it's kind of an interesting process of really understanding what it is that what clients really want, and what they'll pay for. And when they find something that they really want, because it's always part of a bigger portfolio, so it might be that they make some trade-offs and do some things, you know, somewhere else that are, you know, that don't have a premium, and more plain vanilla. They meet the targets, they're reputable projects, and then they can afford to spend a bit more on something that's more, you know, that they're really going to make a lot more noise about. Traders, you know, for traders, I mean, if it's compliance, you just do it at the lowest possible cost. If it's traders on the voluntary carbon market, you know, they're always looking, of course, at the marketability of a particular project. So you know, I certainly wouldn't disregard it. Yeah, for them, I'd say that they'll have a threshold where they know it's still going to be marketable. So you know, a number of traders would want probably to see something like BCS plus BCB, for example, because they know it'll make them more robustly tradable in future. But I think it's the corporate buyers are the key to sort of really unlocking a little bit of extra value if there's something, you know, particularly charismatic about a project.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I'm conscious of the time. We've got a few more questions. I'm going to answer Olivia's, and then maybe we can finish off with Joe's question about bottlenecks on getting reputable auditors and VVBs. Maybe you can speak to that, but I'll just answer Olivia's question quickly. So Olivia's question is that the SBTI net zero standard seems to exclude the use of carbon offsets to reach net zero targets. Won't this be to the detriment of the voluntary market? So Olivia, just to clarify, so in order to reach your net zero target under SBTI, you have to decarbonize significantly, and for most sectors by 90% or more. But that remaining residual 10% or around that, you have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere to compensate for that. So at that point, when you're at net zero or reaching net zero, then you will need to use removal credits in order to balance your book, as it were. But in the meantime, if you have a science-based target, quite rightly, SBTI focuses specifically on decarbonizing your footprint, and that's how it should be. But what it recommends is that along the way, as you decarbonize, you finance emission reductions that are outside of your value chain in order to compensate and take responsibility for the residual emissions that you're not that you're still responsible for on an annual basis as you decarbonize over the next 10 or 15 years. So although SBTI is not quite rightly specifically allowing offsets in order to reach your science-based target, there is a place within the net zero journey for continued use of the voluntary market. And we have seen no slowdown. In fact, we've seen a huge raising of ambition with our corporate clients who are signed up to science-based targets. What they're doing now is two things. They're continuing to take responsibility for their emissions, as I said, as they decarbonize. They're focused on decarbonizing quickly, but they're also now taking action to ensure that they have the removals that they need in 10, 15, 20 years time when they reach the point of having decarbonized in line with science and having to remove the remaining 10 or 8% or wherever it might be of their footprint. So it's all hands on deck in order to do all three of those things. And then I'm conscious of the time, so Rachel, just finally as a final question, Joe's question, I touched on it, but specifically, we're all excited about the significant growth opportunities in NBS project development, but who's thinking about the bottleneck in capacity of reliable, reputable, and established verifiers, VVBs? And I think this is the challenge we're already facing to an extent, but it's but yeah, it'd be great to hear what you think.
Yes, yes, it is one of the sleepless nights things, isn't it, for us all? I mean, I think generally capability in NBS everywhere is, you know, I mean, everyone on this call will be, you know, well aware of how sought after that experience is, and of course everybody's looking for it, from corporates to the standards bodies to the VVBs to, you know, everybody is, you know, it's not an extensively available, there's not an endless supply of people who spent the last 20 years in nature-based solutions, funnily enough. So I think, you know, we're certainly seeing that, and we're building in a lot of extra time when we're planning for verifications and validations and so on in our projects, and really also thinking about, you know, how do we make sure that we've got the monitoring set up really, really well at the start, so that when you come to each verification, you've got everything there and it's really robust, you know. And we've seen lots of places where, you know, you can see common mistakes that get made that mean that you've got these endless iterations. So anything that you can do to sort of compress that time of the interaction with the VVBs is gold dust. But you know, everybody's going to be short of this resource, so it's, you know, it's really about planning ahead and building it into your timescales as a sort of pragmatic measure. And you know, everyone's trying to build the capability.
It's certainly something that's, you know, that's preying on the mind of the standards at the moment, because they recognise that it's the whole process is taking too long, and that is, you know, that's one of the bottlenecks.
And I know they're looking at ways to also make the processes more efficient,
yeah,
as well. But yes, I think that, you know, the pressure is on standards as well to
yeah,
take some inefficiency out of that process.
We're up against time, and I've just seen one question that Martin asked a bit earlier, which I missed, which I think is a kind of feeds onto that. Or Martin made a comment that the Internet of Things, installing sensors on specific individual appliances like fridges, electric cookers, gives detailed feedback. And absolutely, Martin, it is something that the standards are looking to do, is to digitalize monitoring and verification. And it's actually it gives me a good opportunity to finish on a huge plug, in that we have just with Loughborough University, with MEX, we've jointly developed a new methodology for monitored cooking devices, which has been adopted by the gold standard. The first practical application of it will be with electric cooking in East Africa, but it's also applicable to measured dose ethanol, for example, and LPG. But that's the way things are going, and that will make everything quicker and easier in terms of monitoring and verification, particularly for those community type projects. So with that, I'm going to wrap up because we're up against 11 o'clock. Thanks again, everybody, for joining, and I hope it was a useful session. And please do get in touch if you have any more questions. And I think we'll be circulating the recording of the webinar if anyone's interested shortly. So thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the great questions. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.